Hello and welcome to the Jank Diver Gaming Peasant Cube update. My name is Teld and normally Tim does these updates, but he was unavailable to record for this one, so I decided to make an update video for this set. I'm unsure if this is going to end up on the main channel or just my personal one, but either way I'm going to try to keep this relatively short despite having quite a number of cards to discuss. So let's hop in and start with white. The only change to the mono white section is going to be Doom Traveler for Cheeky House Mouse. So Doom Traveler is a leftover from black white being a dedicated sack deck, but honestly it's a bit mopey when you're no longer directly supporting that. The mouse should be a solid aggressive one drop that provides a little bit of value or damage when you're drawing it later into the game. This could be better in the unrestricted because there's less tokens there, but the floor for this card is still just really high. It's hard for a 1-mana 2/1 to be bad. Next up, we've got Kasmina Enigmatic Mentor for Gadwick's first duel. The Warwalkers were really starting to show their age, and while we didn't really set out to remove them, we did end up removing all three of them from the cube. In this one specifically, blue is just not the best color at playing to the board. And so this card ends up being at its best in blue-green, which is kind of drowning in value already if it gets to this stage of the game. And in blue-white, where it's going to provide more value to be casting the 4-drops and the ETB effects like Warlord Rogue on average. I don't think this card is bad by any means. It's just not as optimal as maybe it was a ways back. If you could get the whole trigger of getting 2 2/2s for 4 mana with 2 loots, and the protection effect, this card is excellent, but rarely do you get all of that. Gadwick's first duel could have probably benefited from read ahead more than perhaps any other saga in the set. A lot of times I think the effect 1 isn't going to be super useful depending on the board state. If you drew this exactly on turn 2, I think scrying 2 into the 3rd chapter would be much more powerful. That being said, the whole package seems like a pretty reasonable card, so we'll try it out. We're starting to get a few too many enchantments. It feels like, we're up to 3 in a color that mostly wants to be casting instants and sorceries. That being said, we're swapping a card that wasn't a spell to begin with. So we're swapping a permanent for a permanent, and it felt like an okay change. Next up, we have Brineborn Cutthroat for Picklock Prankster. There's nothing particularly wrong with Brineborn Cutthroat. It's a fine card, but it doesn't have a dedicated or optimal home. The Prankster is just a solid 2-for-1 card at instant speed. It's cheap on both halves, triggers your prowess, magecraft type effects, while also putting more instants and sorceries into your graveyard for cards like the Mouth of Sauron, Invasion of Amonkhet, Gandalf's Sanction, etc., etc. So it's a good early game blocker. It's a decent dorky attacker if you need it to be. So next up, we have Birthday Escape for Sleight of Hand. We decided to go ahead and remove Tempt as a mechanic to reduce the mental clutter of having to keep track of the emblem, especially when most of the time it's just going to be Sculpt. Birthday Escape doesn't really provide any card selection while Sleight of Hand does. So while Sleight of Hand is not the most exciting card in the world, it is going to be better on average at helping you do what you want your blue cantrips to do. Obviously, cantrips are generally quite powerful cards. Birthday Escape was just a little below the bar because when you draw a card without any sort of selection, you're just drawing the card that you would have had if you hadn't have put Birthday Escape in your deck. And when you're spending mana to do that, even if it's only 1, that's not the greatest thing in the world. Next up, we've got Glorious Gale for Essence Scatter. Again, if we're removing Tempt, we decided to put the classic back in and avoid the additive distraction of those extra 10 words that never come up. Moving into black, we've got Back for Seconds swapped for Unburial Rites. Rites has less big targets than it used to, and honestly, it's a black-white card that's been holding a mono-black slot. We've kind of held out on that because we've been waiting for a truly powerful effect to replace it, and Back for Seconds looks like it'll provide solid value, and in the black-white deck specifically, should be a little easier to bargain, triggering it at least semi-reliably, and gives you a good amount of board presence. In addition, one of the things that deck is trying to do is reanimate cards when either reanimate a Breathless Knight or an Archfiend's Vessel, or reanimate a card with the Breathless Knight on the board. And Back for Seconds will be able to do that for you. Next up, we have Stitcher's Supplier for Fairy Dream Thief. Supplier is a powerful but kind of narrow constructed card, and it doesn't always translate well into the context of Cube, even in this more synergistic environment. Frequently, it ends up being a functional mulligan to put 7 cards into the yard, which isn't bad, but also not the greatest thing in the world. Really, the only time you're happy to play this card is when you have a card like Deadly Dispute or Village Rites to be able to get some card draw off of it. And then now it's a combo. So we decided to try out the Dream Thief. It's not exciting, but it should provide some card selection. It's an early aggressive evasion body, and it's a bit of late game card advantage that's basically a strict upgrade to Unwilling Ingredient, which wasn't good, but also wasn't the worst thing in the world. I think flying is a lot better, as well as the card selection being nice. We'll see how this one plays. We're not really expecting the world out of this one, but should be a decent role player for the Black-Red Sack deck or the Black-White mid-range deck. Next up, we've got possibly the most exciting card for Peasant in the set with Lord Skitter's Butcher. This one feels like a slam dunk. And while there's nothing particularly wrong with Skullport Merchant, something had to go to place this one. And we think Skullport Merchant is worse at drawing cards than Fellstinger or a card like Vampiric Rites. Neither the token creation effect or the sack effect is the best in slot version of the effect, but the fact that you can have either mode depending on what the state of the game is really, really nice, on top of being a reasonable body. The third mode is probably going to be less used than the other 2 modes, but it's also extremely powerful when it's good. And this is a good example of powerful modality where each of the effects is maybe not the best version of the effect, but you aren't giving up that much to do it. And then you also, on top of that, are getting a very, very powerful extra button that you'll occasionally get to click to win the game. So Painful Bond is coming out so we can try out Vampiric Rites. We've wanted this one for a while, and it cost us an alchemy slot to put it in, so we decided no one would really care too much. Most of the best effects in black encourage sacrificing dorky things anyway, so this just gives you more fuel for that. We're unsure how powerful it'll be, but this card does have a lot of upside, and unlike a lot of these effects, it gains you life instead of losing you life when you sack things, which could help you get out of burn range or keep you from just paying too much life to all of your cards. So this next change is a bit of a housekeeping change. When we decided we were going to get rid of the Tempt, we get to swap Golem's Bite and that horrific looking art for Disfigure, the classic. Most of the text on this card is additive distraction. We never saw it actually be used with the 4-mana function unless you were completely out of things to do, and even then it was usually meaningless. So Gloomfang Mauler is getting swapped for Troll of Khazad-dûm. We had put Mauler in as a dedicated reanimation target, but as we moved the direction of that into more focused on being kind of a mid-rangey, value-y reanimator game plan, and when we decided that blue-black wasn't going to be a traditional reanimator deck either, a card like Gloomfang Mauler loses a lot of its luster, while Troll of Khazad-dûm is just a generically easier to cast, more reliable card, and Cycle 1 is much, much cheaper than Cycle 2, which allows you to use this to fix your mana more frequently, leading to more games of real magic. Moving into red, we have Goblin Banneret swapped for Embereth Veteran. The Banneret has aged particularly well, and Veteran's a strong 1-drop with decent upside. It's the first time, to my knowledge, that we have a red 1-drop on the client that is a 2/1 with no downsides. This is especially nice if you have a card like Ginger Brute or a 1/1 flying spirit token, because putting it on to an evasive creature means that you'll be able to get it up to potentially 4 power and toughness worth of stats, which will push damage rather effectively. There's going to come a time pretty quickly where your veteran is no longer really able to do anything, and so the extra utility on that, even if it doesn't come up super often, will be nice and pure upside. The Banneret also has a PS2 style art. It looks really digital, CGI, and cheap, so I'm glad to replace it with something that is at least acceptable quality art. And speaking of art, we're actually moving Kinetic Augur to Hearth Elemental, which I think the Elemental is actually kind of sweet. I think it's one of the more Eldraine-y feeling cards in the set. So the Augur's a solid card, and it's been here for a very long time, but we really like the upside of the Elemental. If you're curving out and still have cards in your hand, but you're casting a lot of spells, which is very frequent in the blue-red decks, this card's going to be better because it's going to be super efficient. It actually generates card advantage when you're out of gas instead of just cycling cards like lands, for example. And that extra ability to generate true value puts it over the edge for me. Stoke Genius, also obviously being a sorcery, will trigger your Magecraft type effects, stuff like Young Pyromancer or Balmor. And we covered this card in pretty great detail in our set review, so if you want to hear more about it, go see that, but I'm pretty excited about this card. So Invasion of Mercadia is getting swapped for Monstrous Rage. Invasion of Mercadia wasn't bad, but we really don't need 2 of this effect in the cube. Combat tricks do struggle a little bit in cube, but this one's priced to move to the point that we felt like we had to try it. The ability to push damage super effectively while also leaving behind value for 1 mana makes this a really interesting card. Oftentimes in the early game, your red aggressive decks, your opponent's going to be putting their creature with exactly enough to trade onto your creature just because of the state of the game. And so if your monstrous roll token allows you to outsize that creature, live through the trade, push damage, and then have a card left behind with better stats and trample, this card will be an excellent deal for 1 mana, even if it does expose you to being blown out by removal as combat tricks do. We did end up swapping Bitter Reunion as well for Witch's Mark. The Reunion is a solid card. It has some definite upsides over the Witch's Mark, but we decided that generally speaking, blue and red want their cards to be instants and sorceries for non-creatures to trigger cards like Magecraft. This will trigger your Young Pyromancer, which is a big upside that the Bitter Reunion doesn't do. And creating a Wicked Roll token will allow you to set up attacks that you otherwise didn't have and guarantee a little bit of damage. We think overall the package on this one's really nice. And honestly, I actually really like the Witch's Mark's art as well. It's just a nice, really symmetrical design. It's kind of ominous looking, and the Brothers War art was, it's okay. Ranger's Firebrand is coming out for Torch the Tower. Firebrand was better than the other Tempt cards, but we're removing the entire mechanic, and the Torch is mechanically cleaner just by having more words because it explains to you exactly what the card does. So reading the card does in fact explain the card. Also, we've noticed there's a lot of recursion in the cube at the moment, so adding another exile effect will help. There's not quite as much of that here in the Peasant Cube as there is in the Unrestricted Cube. Overall, this should be a good addition to the cube. So much like in the Unrestricted Cube, we're going to go ahead and replace the Deal 5 that we were running in the Peasant Cube with Witchstalker Frenzy. Very high on this card. It should just be more mana efficient on average, allowing you to kill a mid to large size creature for 1 to 2 mana. There's not a lot of equipment for the salvo to actually deal 5 for 2 mana, and the Indestructible Clause isn't going to come up super often. Witchstalker Frenzy just looks like one of the better cards in the set, to be honest, so it should be excellent. So moving on to our next Planeswalker that's getting the cut, we have Chandra Novice Pyromancer out for Ratcatcher Trainee. Trainee isn't the best 2-drop in a cube with Aether Chaser and other cards like that, but it's decent enough as an aggressive 2-drop and will provide a little bit of value later into the game while, again, playing well with Pyromancer in red. If you're wondering why I keep bringing this up, it's because for some reason people like to play these mono red or Boros aggro decks with Young Pyromancer in them and frequently run into issues where they're not able to trigger it as often. So we're giving the people what they want and having more cards that can trigger Young Pyromancer for your red aggressive decks as opposed to just the blue-red spells deck. Chandra's okay, but 4 mana for 2 shocks isn't the best thing in the world. And so while this card can even plus to get a 3rd shock, that's just a lot of time for a mono red deck, and you're having to protect the Chandra while you're doing this. Either this or Kiora were the best of the Planeswalkers, and the 3 that were left were heads and shoulders above the other ones, but just mechanically it felt nice to clean up all of these to replace them with more efficient cards. So Volcanic Spite for Fire Prophecy. Since we removed the Planeswalkers and the battles, we felt like we no longer needed Volcanic Spite. Fire Prophecy is just a more iconic art, even if it is a little bit unsettling. This is just another housekeeping change. We run Volcanic Spite in the Unrestricted Cube, but part of a Peasant Cube is about remembering sweet limited formats, and Fire Prophecy, while I don't love Ikoria, was one of the more iconic cards out of that limited environment. We've got Wolf Willowhaven out for Utopia Sprawl. Utopia Sprawl is probably the best card in the set, but we're trying to limit the amount of no interaction ramp that is available. We don't really like the idea of having all of your ramp spells be this cheap and efficient while also not being able to be bolted. Utopia Sprawl is definitely a power upgrade for these heavy green decks, but that's all there is really to this one. Is we didn't want to replace one of the creatures you could interact with for a card you can't. Blanchwood Prowler is out for Up the Beanstalk. The Prowler's kind of unnecessary, to be honest. Green has a few too many 2-drops, and in this role, Satyr Wayfinder is just a better card. You don't really need 2 of that in your cube. Up the Beanstalk is a very high floor card by comparison. It cycles on ETB and only needs to trigger 1 more time to be really good. If you trigger it more than once, where you're drawing 3 or 4 cards off of this card overall, it's going to be very, very powerful, and green mid-range in this environment often has a relatively high top end count. So we're swapping Dread Lenorm for Stormkeld Vanguard. The Lenorm's just a bit too expensive on both ends to really be good. Both sides of this card are relatively powerful, but the Stormkeld is a little bit easier to play as a finisher and also allows us to sneak in another disenchant into the cube, which we did add a couple of decent enchantments in this set. Serving the Conduit's getting replaced with Prosperous Innkeeper. The Innkeeper should just be better on average. You lose one shot at your ramp, but generating a game object and padding your life total are both nice, with some implications for this Bant Blink archetype that occasionally shows up. The Conduit really doesn't matter all that often as a bear, and while it does come up, I think on average the Innkeeper is just going to be better. The Innkeeper was a pretty highly played constructed card, and might still be, and that probably is a good signal that this card, since it's not very narrow, should be very good. So Claim to Fame is coming out for Callous Sellsword. The claim is good. In fact, very good at times, but we're getting a bit recursion heavy in the mono black section, and Sellsword adds an interesting, unique effect that could even see play just as a red sorcery for the Thud in, for example, a Gruul deck, where sometimes you just want to fling one of your 4 or 5 drops at your opponent to kill them. In red-black specifically, this card should frequently be able to trade for something with the burn together or push some damage while also giving you a 2-mana 3/3 or 4/4, which would be really nice. So Baird Argivian Recruiter. It's coming out for Imadane's Recruiter. It was getting harder and harder to trigger Baird. It's a card that's really interesting to revisit if the Boros equipment thing ever gets there and we decide to use it in the cube, but at the moment, Imadane's should be better in the kind of go wide aggro deck that Boros tends to play out as. It's got a strong mid to late game sequence as well of getting the 2/2/2s, and then on your next turn having a 2 or a 3 drop, perhaps a freshly drawn one, to play into the Imadane's Recruiter, giving it haste, pumping your entire now wide board, and swinging for lethal. I could also see this card being splashed in a Mardu or Naya deck where you want to take advantage of the fact that it makes some game objects. Ellis Ilkor is coming out for Shrouded Shepherd. Ellis was a leftover from when Black-White was a sack deck, and while it was a totally reasonable early game play or alpha enabler, the Shepherd was just a slam dunk, and we actually considered it so good that we thought about jamming it into the mono white section since it's better than a number of our 2-drops we currently play. Both sides are great, and the art even looks great on this one, despite kind of looking like a Kaldheim card. Kiora Behemoth Becketer's coming out for Troyan Gutsy Explorer. Kiora was the best of the remaining walkers, I think, if I had to pick just one, but Troyan looks like an exciting replacement. This card is extremely explosive, but a little fragile. It would probably be too obnoxious as a 1/4, so I think it had to be a 1/3. In any case, this allows you to slam a 6-drop on turn 4 with 0 help, or on turn 3 if you had a 1-mana dork, so you cast this on turn 2. Blue-green tends to play a lot of top end as a bit of a ramp deck, and it even finds you action if you're flooding. So we think that while this card is a little bit narrow in what you can spend the mana on, finding you things to cast with it should be good enough as a floor. On the game states where you get to cast a 5 or a 6 drop on turn 3 or 4, this card should be a massive overperformer. Finally, we have Uncharted Haven for Edgewall Inn. This is just a strict upgrade. The Edgewall Inn is Uncharted Haven with the ability to later in the game sacrifice it to return a card that has adventure in it from the graveyard to the hand. We really like this one because there's a number of adventures floating around in the cube, and it's kind of a free roll into this land slot. It should provide a little bit of extra action in the late game, and with adventures being a natural 2-for-1, this card might play out more like a draw 2 than this effect normally does. So after I initially finished recording this update, Tim and I were able to get together and finish hammering out a change we've been pondering for a little bit. So I'm going to be adding this as an extra section to our set update. Essentially, the green-white counters deck has been existing in a bit of a parasitic state where it doesn't particularly play well with other cards like we want it to. So we're taking advantage of white's ability to produce tokens and some go-wide payoffs to move green-white into a more mid-rangey space that should better take advantage of both what white is doing as well as green's natural, more mid-range tendencies. So for the white section, we're swapping out Grateful Apparition for Shire Sheriff. We're a little hesitant on Banisher Priests. They tend to be a bit overrated, but we didn't just want to add a bunch of Mold Drifters that would ETB and make tokens. So this was one that could be a reasonable 2-drop in an aggressive deck that also allows you to get rid of blockers and just take advantage of having tokens. Abzan Falconer's coming out for Rosie Cotton of South Lane. Rosie is another strong way of taking advantage of being able to make tokens by adding to your board presence. It's a really exciting card, though it does combo with Scurry Oak in a sort of Splinter Twin way. So we decided that we thought Rosie was a more interesting card and wanted to test this out. Without direct +1/+1 counter synergies, Abzan Falconer isn't really necessary. So Visionary Augmenter is coming in for Gavony Silversmith. Silversmith could have probably been left around as just a good card. But if you aren't actually using the +1/+1 counter synergies, it's not the best card in the world. Augmenter's an old classic, and we're pretty happy to have it back. We felt like it was a good middle ground. We considered playing a card like Release the Hounds that would add just more tokens to the board, but this is token support that works well with the blue-white blink deck and the sort of reanimator theme that we've got going on in black-white, so we like that a little better. Intangible Virtue is coming in for Gird for Battle, and it should be excellent if the tokens deck has legs. Been a long time now, but this card was actually banned in Innistrad Block Constructed, and now that we're directly supporting a tokens deck, I'm pretty excited to see if Intangible Virtue can still be good. This card will enable some of your most explosive draws, I'm sure. We're swapping out Valorous Stance for You Hear Something on Watch. Stance is a good card, but the slot it's holding isn't really a necessary one, so we decided we wanted to try You Hear Something on Watch, which has some nice modality as a pretty solid removal spell that'll kill most attacking creatures, and also a pump effect. These should be good in a number of decks and just provide that tokens deck with the ability to get another board pump effect. So Woodland Champion is an interesting token payoff in that it goes tall as opposed to wide. One of the nice things about this is that oftentimes the token deck is good at making a lot of things, but not really good at attacking because the cards are individually small. Woodland Champion gets around that and will frequently be an overstated creature if you've constructed the deck in a way that makes sense. Peregrine Took is coming in for Evolution Sage. This card generates a good bit of value across the game. The food tokens can work with cards like Rosie Cotton or Shire Sheriff that only care about you having tokens, or if you end up with a number of food tokens, you can then start generating extra card advantage to play to the mid-range side of this game plan. Scurry Oak, as mentioned, had to come out if we wanted to play Rosie Cotton. While Scurry Oak is probably a more generically powerful card, Rosie is certainly more interesting. Incubation Sac is a card that we decided to run because the grade 3 drops that we're currently not playing just don't really get there. Incubation Sac provides good grindy value, though it is a little bit mana intensive. It also plays well with cards like Bargain, for example. After you've gotten rid of all of the counters, you can sack it and put it in your graveyard and then potentially buy it back. Alternatively, you might be able to bounce it with a card like Chorus Skyfisher. We're swapping Fungal Rebirth in for Valaged Recovery. We had Fungal Rebirth in the past and it was a totally fine card. Valaged Recovery has an interesting flexibility of being a land, but honestly it ends up just being a bad land and a bad regrowth. Fungal Rebirth kind of signals some synergy with green-black, and we're trying to see just a little bit of support to be able to allow green-black to take advantage of the sack synergies, given that it normally plays out very much as a mid-range deck. Chainweb Arachneer is not aged as well as we'd like. The escape oftentimes does not matter, though it can be okay. And the removal effect is generally kind of weak if you aren't escaping it. Glimmerbear might be a little too cute, both in terms of art and effect, but Tokatog here just has such a high ceiling. All these cards that we've added that make random tokens make this card able to threaten a lot of damage, and there will come a point rather quickly where your opponent is just obligated to block it. So we're interested to see if this card actually plays out in that way, or if it ends up being a bit too cute. So Cankerbloom is a fine enough card, but we're swapping it in for Sapperling Migration. We're trying to not add too many green 2s. There's so many of them already in a color that oftentimes wants to use its 2 for mana dorks. That being said, Sapperling Migration is a rock solid card, making a couple of tokens if you play it early, and then late game it has an ability to just absolutely clog up a board. Bloom was sitting in kind of a generic card slot of good cards, so we're going to try this out. I wouldn't be surprised if a card like the Cankerbloom comes back in, just because the card is generically quite powerful. Speaking of swapping generically powerful cards for more narrow but archetype specific cards, Agatha's Champion is coming in for Somberwolf Stag. Stag is a very powerful card in this cube and plays really well in these sort of grindy mid-range decks that I like to draft, but we decided we wanted to try this out just to seed a little more direct support for this bargain tokens sort of game plan that we're working with. and we'll encourage people to facilitate deck building in that way. If you get the full package, the Agatha's Champion will be able to kill creatures with 3 power, which is something the Somberwall Stag can't do without trading. Additionally, the champion has Trample, which makes it a much better attacker. Now, it does need to be mentioned that cards like Soul Herder do work with Stag, but will not work with Champion. So those do need to be kept in mind, but the Champion should be an interesting card. If it ends up being bad, we can swap it back out for Stag, because Stag has been a rock solid Magic card in this cube. Skyshroud Ambush has somehow managed to sit around in this cube, but it's a silly busted 2-for-1 for 2 mana. You very frequently just play this when your opponent is tapped out or in response to their removal to kill one of their creatures and draw an extra card. It's just very silly how good this card is, and it's an alchemy card, so no one's going to miss it. Spinning Wheel Kick was one that we were thinking about putting in a 2-mana fight spell, but given that we currently don't have Bear Punch since Cons isn't out, we decided to try Spinning Wheel Kick as a sort of board buster, card advantage-y fight spell. We have other slots dedicated to the cheaper fight effects. This card will require a little bit of setup and will require you to not be in a position where your opponent can blow you out with removal if you can help it, but should also just win you the game very often if you resolve this for X is 2 or greater. So Chris doesn't know that Tim and I put this card in, so no one tell him. Cultivate hasn't held up very well, and Beanstalk Giant is a pretty solid card as a ramp spell that then draws us a expensive, if kind of clunky finisher to play afterwards. In that way, it kind of works like a worse version of Settle the Wilds, which was way too good. So we're hoping Beanstalk Giant will meet somewhere in the middle. We also added cards like Edgewall in that do care about adventures to some degree, so getting another green adventure into the cube is something that we were pretty excited to do. Arborback Stomper is getting swapped for Bestial Menace. I'm just going to acknowledge up front, this is almost certainly a downgrade. We just wanted to make sure that we put enough support in for the tokens deck to actually get there. Arborback Stomper is generically just kind of a messed up Magic card as a very powerful body that also stabilizes your life total. That being said, I would not be surprised if we see the Stomper back in at some point, but we're going to give Bestial Menace a shot to see how it plays in this cube with the new archetype. So now just some gold card cleanups, since we're no longer caring about +1/+1 counters. Botanical Brawler and Conclave Mentor don't really make any sense, so we're swapping that for Iron Root Warlord, which should be a relatively big creature. At worst, it's a 3-mana 1/5, but it'll most of the time be a good bit bigger than that and should consistently be a massively overstated creature for its mana cost that also lets you convert your mana into more board presence if you're flooding a little bit. Conclave Mentor was kind of the one card that held the entire green-white counters archetype together at this point. We're swapping it for Shauna Sisay's Legacy as another Goyf-like overstated creature. This card will come down on 2 and very frequently by turn 3 or 4 should be a good bit bigger. This deck should be good at making extra bodies and taking advantage of Shauna being a 2-mana 4/4 or bigger. Pledge of Unity was one that we originally were just going to keep in, but we decided since we're making this change that we wanted to go ahead and try a different card in this slot. It could be that Pledge is just good enough that we want to end up bringing it back in, but we're going to try Appeal to Authority, where Appeal allows you to go tall on one of your tokens once you get big, and the Trample will allow you to push damage effectively. Additionally, Authority, being able to tap 2 creatures and giving your creatures Vigilance, will be a nice bit of explosiveness when you cast this full card effect for 3 mana. Wayfarer's Bauble was a new addition, but we decided to go ahead and just cut it for Sigil of Valor. There's a million of these sort of random mana artifacts, and we don't really need that many. Most of the time, only 1 or 2 of them see play in a given cube. Sigil of Valor, as a colorless card, is taking up a slot that is more or less free, so we wanted to give it a shot as a tokens go wide payoff. If you put this on an evasive creature, then you should be able to attack for quite a bit. It definitely has some interesting implications going on with it, and also Equip 1 makes it cheap enough that I'm actually excited to try this card. And then finally, this isn't anything to do with the Selesnya rework, but we did decide that we were going to put in Cling to Dust for Ashnod's Harvester. This was a last-minute swap that we decided to do. Cling to Dust sees play in multiple constructed formats and should provide nice graveyard hate that isn't quite as reliant on attacking with a 3/1. This card's just rock solid and will provide some interesting tension because escaping it will also sometimes mean getting rid of spells in your graveyard or creatures that you would like to recur. So we're interested to see how that plays. So thank you for joining me for this cube update. If you would like to try out the Peasant Cube or any of the other cubes we run, you can find us on the Jank Diver Gaming Discord, where we organize cube drafts on Wednesday and Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you want to play the Peasant, you can come in on Wednesday. If you'd like to try our unrestricted cube, you can play on Sundays. We have an active community of cubers who enjoy talking about Limited, among other Magic the Gathering related topics. You can find more great content on the Jank Diver Gaming YouTube channel, and I stream most of our drafts on twitch.tv/Teld Talks. Additionally, you can check out the Jank Tank podcast, where Tim, Chris, and myself will discuss various cube-related topics, as well as doing set reviews for the historic card pool. Again, thank you for joining me. I hope you have a great day. Chris doesn't know that Tim and I put Beanstalk Giant in the Peasant Cube. Alright, yeah, there's no way that's making it in.